Test. All right. The Greek anthology. Constance turned herself awkwardly on the bed to watch him leave the room. I've been thinking about this all day long, Bob said. I want you. Then he was gone with his voice trailing away to hear it down the hall to another room. She lay there awkwardly, waiting for him to return. She thought it was only that he was only going to be gone for a moment, but he was gone for almost 10 minutes. The air in the bedroom was warm and still. It was an unusually warm September evening in San Francisco, but the window was closed and the shades were down. They had to be. He can't find the book, she thought. He was always losing things. For many long months now, had a lot of trouble doing anything right. It made her sad because she loved him. She sighed, which became a slight muffled sound because of the handkerchief that was loosely stuffed in her mouth. She could have easily pushed the handkerchief out of her mouth with her tongue if she had wanted to. Bob couldn't do anything right now. He couldn't even gag her well. But of course he had tied her hands too tight and her feet too loose, and she sighed again, making a muffled sound as she waited for him to find the book that he'd lost, which was usual for everything he did now. He hadn't always been this way, and she felt guilty about it because she thought that it was partly her fault for giving him the warts, and after he got the warts, all this stuff started happening. The light hanging down from the ceiling should have been a 100-watt bulb, but instead it was a 200-watt bulb. It was his doing. She didn't like that much light. He did. Finally, he came back into the room with the book, and she pushed the gag out of her mouth and said, "My hands are too tight." "Oh," he said, looking down from her at the book, from the book in his hand, which had turned to a particular page he was just about to read aloud. He put the book down on the bed, still open to the page that he wanted to read from. He sat down beside her, and she rolled awkwardly over onto her stomach so that he could get it all the knot in the rope. She didn't have any clothes on. She had a nice body. He retied her hands so that they weren't as tight, but they were still tight enough so that she couldn't get them loose. "Retie my feet," she said. "They're too loose." If he's going to be an amateur sadist, she thought, might as well see if I can get him to do it right. She was very disappointed at him. She was a perfectionist in everything that she did and was very annoyed with his newly felt incompetence. For months now, ever since he had gone on his amateur sadist trip, she'd been thinking, anyone can tie anybody up and gag them, so why can't he? Why can't he do anything right? And he overwaters the plants and drops things out of his hands, and he's always falling over things and breaking things, and he forgets what he's talking about half the time in the middle of what he's saying. But I guess it really doesn't make that much of a difference because he doesn't talk about anything interesting anyway. It's been going on for months, ever since she gave him the warts. But hadn't she suffered with them too, going to the doctor all those times and having the warts burned off in her vagina with an electric needle, and coming home on the bus, holding back the tears in a lonely moving place filled with silent strangers? Oh God, oh well, we could be dead. Maybe this is better than being dead, I guess. I don't know. After he finished tying her feet again, he started to pick up the book that he had been about to read from. Then he noticed that the gag was out of her mouth. He put the book back down and leaned over toward her. She knew what he wanted and what he was going to do. She opened her mouth as wide as she could. He suddenly got nervous. Sometimes when he gagged her, he pushed part of the gag against her lower lip with his thumb. It would hurt her mouth as it was going in, and she really got mad at him and cursed him bastard. Then the gag would be in her mouth, and her curses would be muffled or inarticulate. But he knew what she was saying, and it always made him feel bad. And sometimes he would blush, and his ears would tingle with embarrassment. She would glower up with him from beautiful green eyes. He would turn away from them and wait for her to calm down. He didn't like being incompetent, but there was nothing he could do about it. It had been going on for months and it didn't make him feel very good either. He could tell by how wide she had just opened her mouth that he had better control his nervousness and not hurt her when he put that gag back in her mouth. Her mouth was delicate, her tongue sculptured in pink. The gag was already very wet from her spit. He put it carefully back into her mouth, making sure that he did not hurt her with her thumb. He took his index finger and worked the gag back into all the crevices of her mouth. She lay there on her stomach with her hands tied behind her back, resting just above her ass. Her head was arched back now, so she would be in a better position for him to gag her. They had done this many times. The room was illuminated by a light that was too bright. She had long blonde hair. There was just a small piece of the gag sticking out between her teeth. He very carefully tucked that piece into her mouth. Then he gave the gag a good push from his finger straight back into her mouth, so it doesn't make her tongue totally immobile, useless to push the gag out with. He was very nervous and he tried to control it because he didn't want to hurt her, but he also wanted the gag to be firmly in her mouth. She moved behind the gag when he started pushing it back into place with his finger. She moved her head suddenly side to side as it escaped the finger that was pushing the gag against her tongue. He continued her, pushing for a few more seconds, and then he knew it was in place, and she would not be able to work it out with her tongue. About every once in every 10 minutes, 10 times, he would gag her effectively. He just didn't have it together anymore. He knew his failures annoyed her, but what else could he do? His whole life was a sloppy and painful mess. He'd used adhesive tape for a while. The tape always gagged her effectively, but she didn't like the way it hurt when it pulled off. Even if he pulled it off very gently, it still felt like hell, so the tape had to go. No, she had said about the tape, and he knew that was a no. She never said no before, so he stopped using the tape. He took his finger out of her mouth and stroked the side of her face. She relaxed her head. He stroked her hair. She stared slightly up at him. She really had very beautiful eyes. Everybody always mentioned that to her. She awkwardly crawled and inched her body over to him. It was difficult, but she got her head up onto his lap and she was staring up at him. Her hair poured over his head like blonde water. She really loved him. That's what made it all so bad. Can you breathe all right? He said. She nodded her head gently so he could breathe all right. She could breathe all right. Does the gag hurt? She shook her head gently so the gag did not hurt. Do you want to hear what I read today? She nodded her head gently, but she wanted to hear what he had read today. He picked up the book. It was a very old book. He read this to her. O poverty, though grievous and restless evil, with what thy sister helplessness overwhelmeth the great people. She stared up at him. That's Alcaeus from the Greek mythology, he said. That was written over 2,000 years ago. Oh God, she thought, and tried very hard not to cry because she knew if she started crying, it would make him feel even worse. He had been feeling pretty bad for a long time. The story of O. Constance and Bob's fourth-rate theater of sadism and despair started off rather simply. She was the first one to get the warts. They were venereal warts inside of her vagina. She had a drunken one-night-stand love affair with a middle-aged lawyer who'd read her book. He was a 23-year-old just failed novelist and told her that he liked her book, and she was feeling very badly because the book, though it was a critical success, was not selling. She'd been forced to go back to work. So she went to bed with the lawyer and got warts in her vagina. They looked like a hideous clump of nightmare mushrooms. They had to be burned off with an electric needle, one painful treatment following the cause of another painful treatment. When she found out that she had the warts, she talked to Bod about ending their marriage. She felt so embarrassed. She thought there was no reason to continue her life. Please, she said, I can't go on living with you. I've done such a terrible thing. No way, Bob told her. It was so good to her, knowing all about the affair, and he took care of everything in a super effective way, which is how he handled things then. They could not have a normal sex life for 2 months because that's how long it took for the warts to be burned out of her vagina. Sometimes when she came home from seeing the doctor at his electric needle, she'd just sit down and start crying. Bob comforted her, took care of her, and made her feel better, caressing her hair, holding her, talking gently to her. You're my woman. I love you. It'll all be over soon until she stopped crying. Because they were denied access to a traditional sex life, venereal warts are caused by a communicable virus, which that's sort of that virus is transmitted through intercourse. They had to do other things, which they did. They really liked having intercourse together. Bob loved the way his penis felt inside of her Constance's vagina. She did too. They used to make jokes about erotic plumbing. There was that some kind of traditional sex fiends. One day, someone loaned Bob a copy of the story of O, which he read. It's a gothic sadomasochistic novel that sort of turned him on because he thought it was so strange. He would get a partial erection when he read it. After he finished the book, he gave it to Constance to read because she was curious about it. What's it about? She asked. She read it and got sort of turned on too. It's kind of sexy, she said. A week after that, they both finished reading it. They were drunkish one evening and sexually plague around their special ways because they were denied the regular sex act. Usually she would jack him off or only copulate him to get very carefully, like cutting a diamond, clearly masturbate her until she came. He could have gotten a job at Tiffany's. They were lying there in bed, sort of drunk, when he said, Why don't we play the story of O? Okay, Constance said, smiling. Which part do I play? The story of O Game. They had a lot of fun playing the story of O Game for the first time. Constance found some scarves for him to tie up her with, and she found a large silk handkerchief for him to gag her with. Bob tied a knot in the center of the handkerchief as soon as he had seen it on television in the movies, and put the knot between her teeth and tied the ends of the handkerchief tightly at the back of her head, so her mouth was forced open by the knot. Her hands were tied behind her back. She was breathing very heavily. She had never been tied and gagged before. He caressed her breast and her thighs. She liked the feeling of helplessness and pleasure. Then he whipped her very gently with his belt, and she moaned pleasurably from behind the gag. While this was all happening, still had his clothes on. She lay naked on the bed. After a while, he took his clothes off and joined her on the bed. She rubbed up against him, moaning all the time through the gag. She was very excited. He put his finger on her clitoris diamondly, so as to avoid touching the burned off wart areas and hurting her. He was not interested in hurting her. Bob rolled Constance over so that her back was to him, and he guided her bound hands to his penis and had his left hand touching her clitoris, and his right hand caressing her right breast, which was quite beautiful, not too small and not too large, with a small pink rose nipple. Constance awkwardly and beautifully jacked him off while he masturbated her carefully and beautifully, and they also almost came together. Their bodies raged like an apocalypse of fire, pleasure, and small-time perversion. Warts. When the warts were discovered inside of Constance's vagina, Bob checked himself out for them, but there weren't any warts on his penis. Venereal warts are spread by a virus through sexual intercourse, but only a small percentage of the people who come in contact with the virus actually get them. So some people will carry the virus and not get the warts, and some people who come in contact with the virus without getting them. Bob was very relieved he did not have them. Weeks passed and no warts appeared on his penis, so he assumed they would not get them. But the one night when she was almost clear of him, he was peeing and he discovered he did have some warts inside his penis. He never dawned on him to look inside of his penis, down to the urethra. The warts were like an evil little island of pink mucus roses. He couldn't believe it. He stood there staring at the warts in his penis. He thought he was going to throw up. As long as he had finished peeing, the light was still standing there above the toilet bowl, staring at his penis. Then he pushed it back down his pants severe, folding a dead octopus tentacle into his shorts, flushed the toilet. The urine swirled like an evil punctuation mark and disappeared. The sun was going down too. He waited for Constance to come home from visiting a friend. The apartment was very quiet. He didn't turn the lights on. Normally he hated the dark. He stared out the window at the early evening traffic that sounded like rain. He shivered as if he were cold. The cars passing down below him made him think of a very lonely rainy afternoon in his childhood. He went back there again. When he when she opened the door with her key and came in, the apartment was dark, so she turned the light on. She didn't think he was there. He was sitting in the room a few feet away from her, staring out the window with eyes that looked like they had transparent light in them. What's wrong? She said. I've got warts in my cock, he said. She sat down very carefully on the floor right in front of him, as if she were sitting on a decayed spider web. Deeply do I mourn, for my friends are nothing worth. These are just fragments, Bob said, almost a year later to Constance, lying down and gagged in bed without any clothes on, her head resting in his lap. Lines, he said. Parts of lines, he paused and forgot for a moment what he was talking about. Constance waited for him to remember what he was talking about. He was turning the pages of the book, but he didn't know why. They turned like leaves in absent-minded wind. Then he remembered what he was doing and started over again, repeating the very same words he had just used. They're just fragments, lines, he said. Parts of lines, sometimes the only single words that remain from the original poems written by the Greeks thousands of years ago. More beautiful, Bob said. That's all that's left of the poem. Having fled, Bob said. That's all that's left of another one. He cheats you, Bob said. Breaking. You've made me forget all my sorrows. There are three more. Here are two more very beautiful ones, Bob said. Deeply do I mourn, for my friends are nothing worth. Take bites of the cucumbers. What do you think? Do you like him? Bob said. He had forgotten that she could not answer him. She nodded her head yes, that she liked them. Would you like to hear some more? Bob said. He had forgotten there was a gag in her mouth. She slowly nodded yes. Here are four more fragments, Bob said. They are all remains of a man's voice from thousands of years ago. Storms of these. I was. He understood. Incredible, huh? She slowly nodded yes. One more? Bob asked. She very slowly nodded yes. And nothing will come of anything, Bob said. Willard and his bowling trophies. What about Willard and his bowling trophies? How do they figure into this tale of perversion? Easy, they were in an apartment downstairs. Willard was a paper mache bird about 3 feet tall with long black legs and a partially black body covered with a strange red and blue design like nothing ever seen before, and Willard had an exotic beak like a stork. His bowling trophies were, of course, stolen. They were stolen from three brothers, the Logan brothers, who had formed a very good, actually a champion bowling team that they had played on for years. Bowling was their life's blood, and someone stole all their trophies. The Logan brothers had been looking for them ever since, traveling around the country like three evil brothers in a western. They were lean, sharp-eyed, and seedy looking for letting all their clothes fall into disrepair, for not shaving regularly, and for turned into vicious criminals to finance their search for the stolen trophies. They had started out in life as wholesome all-American boys, an inspiration to young and old alike, showing how you could make something out of your life you looked up to. Unfortunately, the torment of those young three lost years looking for their bundling trophies had changed them. They're a far cry from the Logan brothers of old, those handsome, heroic bowlers and the pride of their hometown. Willard, of course, always stayed the same, a paper mache bird surrounded by his bowling trophies. And nothing will come of anything. The room was too bright. It was not a large room, and the light bulb hanging down from the ceiling was too big for the room. Cars passed down in the street. The street had a lot of traffic early in the evening. He stared down at her. Bob's face was very gentle and distant and dreaming backwards. He was thinking about people who lived another time and were dead now, and like grieved for them and himself and the entire human condition, the past and future of it all. Constance, staring up at him, was deeply moved by the expression on his face. Suddenly she wanted to tell him that she loved him, even though he had come to this, but she couldn't. Only about every one of 10 times was he able to effectively gag her, and this had to be the time. What luck, she thought. So she caressed his leg with her cheek, which was all that she could do to tell him that she loved him. She wanted to tell him that they would get through this and put it all back together, make it beautiful again, but she couldn't because her whole tongue was pressed hard against the back of her mouth by a handkerchief soaking wet with her own spit. She crossed her eyes, and nothing will ever come of anything, Bob softly repeated again, but this time only to himself. The Logan brothers in pursuit. One of the Logan brothers sat in a chair drinking a can of beer. Another one lay on the bed in the cheap hotel room reading a comic book. From time to time he laughed out loud. The aging wallpaper looked like the skin of a snake. His laughter rattled off the walls. The third brother paced back and forth in the room, which was a slight feat in itself because the room was so small. He was displeased by his brother laughing at the comic book. He thought that his brother should not abandon himself to easy pastimes. Where are those goddamn bowling trophies? He yelled. The Logan brother on the bed dropped his comic book in surprise, and the one drinking beer stopped a can in mid-flight to his mouth and turned it into the statue of a beer can. They stared at their brother, who was still pacing impossibly in the tiny room. Where are those goddamn bowling trophies? They repeated. They were waiting for a telephone call that would tell them where the bowling trophies were. The telephone call was costing about $3,000, money that had been earned from panhandling, misdemeanor thievery, then filling station holdups, and finally murder. It had been a long 3 years they had spent in search of the trophies. The Logan brothers' all American innocence had been one of his casualties. Where are those goddamn bowling trophies? St. Willard. Meanwhile, less than a mile away from the tiny, dingy hotel room where the Logan brothers waited for a telephone call to provide them with the location of the bowling trophies, Willard, a huge paper mache bird, stood leaning up against the trophies. There were 50 of them sitting on the floor, large, elaborate ones like miniature bowling altars and small ones with icons. Willard and the bowling trophies were in the front room of a big apartment. It was night and dark in the front room, but even so, there was a faint religious glow coming from the bowling trophies. Saint Willard of the stolen bowling trophies. The people who lived in the apartment were off seeing a Greta Garbo rerun at a local art theater. Their names were John and Patricia. He was a young filmmaker and she was a school teacher. They were very good friends with their upstairs neighbors, Constance and Bob. Bob would come down by himself 3 or 4 times a week. He would like to sit in the front room on the floor with Willard and the bowling trophies and drink coffee, talk to John about Willard. Pat would usually be off teaching. She taught Spanish at a junior high school. Bob would ask questions about Willard and his metal friends. Often it would be the same question because Bob would forget that he asked it before. Where'd you get the bowling trophies? Bob asked for the 100th time, or was it the 1000th time? It was his favorite question to ask over and over again. I found them in an abandoned car in Marin County, John would patiently answer for the 100th, or was it the 1000th time? John had known Bob for 3 years now, and Bob had not been like this when John first knew him. Bob had been very skillful with all the aspects of his life and had a mind so sharp he could have picnicked on a razor blade. It bothered John to see Bob this way. He hoped it would pass, and Bob would be like he used to be. John sometimes wondered what would happen to cause Bob to act this way, always asking the same questions over and over again. Where'd you get these bowling trophies, etc.? Moving awkwardly about and being absent-minded. Sometimes he tipped his coffee over, and John would clean it up, and Bob would barely be conscious he had done it. Bob had been a hero once to John because he'd been so good at doing and saying things. Those days were gone, and John longed for them to return. The bowling trophies continued glowing faintly in the room where Willard was in a shadow among them like an unspoken prayer. John and Pat would be later back on, talking about Greta Garbo, and turn the front room light on, and there would be faithful Willard and the bowling trophies. Celery. Bob took his belt off and slowly began to whip Constance with it, leaving slight red marks across her buttocks and the backs of her legs. She moaned abstractly from behind the gag, which was firmly in her mouth, and she could not spit it out. Sometimes it had still turned her on when he whipped Hex. It had really turned her on the first few times he had done it to her when they had played the story of O game before he had gotten the warts in his penis and they wouldn't go away. He never broke the flesh when he whipped her or left any bruises on her body. He was very careful about that. He was not interested in hurting her. Whipping her did not turn him on as nearly as tying her up and gagging her, but he went on doing it as part of the ritual that led to this very pathetic sex act, sex act because he liked to hear her moan from behind the gag. The thing that she most really didn't like about it was being gagged, but that was part of it that turned him on the most, and the part of it that he was the worst at doing because he got so excited and nervous when he did it. She could never figure out why he concentrated so much on the gagging, and he never told her because he didn't know himself. Sometimes he tried to figure out why he liked gagging her, but he couldn't find a rational reason. He just liked it and did it. Many times after he finished tying her up, which he always did when he did it first, she would say, "Please don't gag me. It's all right to tie me up and to whip me, but please don't gag me. Sometimes I don't like it." But he would do it anyway, and most of the time he bungled it, and sometimes he hurt her. It was very seldom she liked being gagged, and those few very rare times were only because she remembered liking it in the beginning. He put the belt down beside her on the bed. That part was over. Her eyes were beautiful above the gag, he thought, so sensitive and intelligent staring at him. He untied her feet. "Let's put little garlands of celery on our brows and hold high festival to Dionysus," Bob said to her, quoting the Greek anthology from memory. "Pretty, huh?" he said. She closed her eyes. Rubber. Bob still had his clothes on, but he could still feel the erection in his pants. It bulged and pressed hard against his leg. Now the time was nearing that he really dreaded. The only time he could enter her vagina with his penis so she wouldn't get the worst again was to use a rubber which he hated and she hated. He walked over to a dresser and hidden under his socks was a package of rubbers. He fumbled a rubber out of the package. He felt dirty touching it. Constance was watching him from the bed. She knew how much he hated using them. Bob came back to the bed. He took his clothes off. He had a tall, healthy body. Looking at his body, there was no way of knowing he had warts in his penis. He took his packed rubber and broke the foil and took the horrible thing out and slightly nauseated by the smell of the thing. He really hated that rubber smell. He shuddered when he felt the rubber over his penis and did not look at Constance while he was doing it. Putting the rubber on always embarrassed him, and she looked away too, not wanting to see this embarrassment. The rubber was on, and he felt like a damn fool. The Logan brothers waiting. The comic book reading Logan brother put the comic book down on the bed beside him. He stared at the cover. The hero on it looked somber as a stale cookie. The beer drinking Logan brother finished one beer and started another one. He liked feeling the cold of the can in his hand. It was one of the few pleasures he had left after 3 years of looking for the stolen bowling trophies. The pacing Logan brother was walking up and down the tiny room. He had a revolver in his hand. He kept opening and closing their loaded cylinders, staring at the bullets. He was anxious to use the gun. He wanted to kill the people who had taken his beloved bowling trophies. They would pay dearly with their lives. Soon the telephone would ring. It sat darkly on a table like graves waiting to be dug. The comic book reading Logan brother reopened the comic book to an ad to selling salve in your spare time and on your way home from school. He read the ad very carefully. He wondered how to be the self-salve. Kissing. She hated the feeling of the rubber going into her vagina. She really had to be moist or it hurt. He had such a beautiful penis. It had been so long since she had felt it inside of her. All she had felt for almost a year now was the rubber inside of him. It was a nightmare, and he couldn't do anything right anymore. Oh God, she rubbed her gagged mouth against his mouth in a tender kissing gestures, painting a lion from the claw. He couldn't feel her, and it always made him sad, but that was nothing new because just about everything made him sad now. The rubber took away all lie intimacy and eternity of her vagina. He hungered like a lost star for the evening sky of her touch. He was gently inside of her, but he couldn't feel her. She was lost from him, so he thought about the Greek anthology and remembered words from ancient rhymes that said, painting a lion from the claw. What did it mean to him thinking about that as he rested upon her, trying to make love? What good would it do to think of things like that? He didn't know.